Started. All right, friends, welcome. It is week 6, lecture 2. That means it is belt week. We've got quite a day today. We're going to talk about validations from forms. Then we're going to talk about login and registration, including how we're going to hash passwords and kind of what that means and where we're going to get started there. And how we can fully set up a login and registration. We're basically doing that assignment today. So that's kind of where we're getting started, where we're going. So that's what should be pretty all right. Just a couple of housekeeping things. As always, a reminder of your discussion posts. You have 2 of those due Sunday, so please make sure you do that. Discussion posts do continue into weeks 7 and 8. So make sure you are continuing to do your discussion posts. You have to complete 80% of all discussion posts, which I think is 14. There's 16 total, so I think that math checks out. And so make sure you are doing all of your discussion posts. Assignments, you do have 2 core assignments. It is login and registration, and it is recipes. Those are your 2 core assignments for this week. And so make sure you do those. As a reminder, before you can even take the belt exam, you do have to have 90% assignment completions. And so make sure you are keeping up with your assignments. Sometimes students can skip assignments to get ready for the exam, which I understand. But again, unless you have 90% of core assignments done, unfortunately, you can't even get a code. So please, please, please make sure you are staying up with that. Before I talk about the belt exam, I do want to point out a lot of you guys did get an email today about maybe going on academic probation for discussion questions or assignments. Please know that our system that kind of pulled all the numbers was off. And so please just disregard that email. Don't worry about it. Yeah, it was pulling numbers. A lot of it was saying like, hey, you have 14 out of 14 assignments. You're on academic probation. And it's like, no, you guys are doing great. So sorry about that. We will make sure tomorrow that we get like an actual kind of pulse check of where you guys are at and what you guys are doing or how you're doing, just to make sure that you know how many assignments you have. Again, that way you can get to that 90%. I'm not going to talk a ton about the belt exam because we talked about it yesterday, but just as a reminder, it is going to start on Friday. You will be receiving an email from me Friday morning, basically lays out the belt exam, everything that I talked about yesterday. So if you are curious, you can go watch that email or last lecture, or you can ask me after class, but it'll lay it out for you. It'll give you the code. What you'll do is you'll go to the one thing to note, you go to learn.codingdojo.com. So not actually login.codingdojo.com. So you're going to go to this old school looking one. This is our old platform. I think the new platform will actually take you to there if you try to do exams. I don't have it, but it'll take you there. But up here, you will see where it says dashboard and checklist. There will be one called exams. You'll click on that. It's going to ask you to give it a code. Once you give it a code, it'll pull up your prompt. Just know that once you submit your code, that is when your exam starts. So if you are not ready to take your exam, do not submit a code. Once you submit this code, that is exactly when your exam starts. So please make sure that you are prepared to start it, and you can't cheat and get the wireframe and then give it a while to learn it and then go start the 24 hours. Once you submit that code, that is when everything gets started. Any questions on the belt exam? Any questions from anybody just kind of regarding that and expectations? Perfect. Cool. Well, let's just jump in. Now we have been working on our books and publishers assignment. Now for this one, I did create something new. So let's just kind of walk through what I did. I created this EER, this ERD diagram. One thing I do want to point out is for your assignment or for your belt exam, you will need to submit this right here, this model. That way I can forward engineer it myself and test your code. The way you're going to do that is you're going to come up here, you're going to click this save button. Here, you're going to save. You're going to title it, something like belt exam. Something, whatever you want to call it, belt exam will. Save it somewhere in your desktop, and it's going to be an MWB. Once you save it, make sure you attach that file within your project folder. So make sure that is attached. Do not forget to do that because I need that in order to forward engineer that entire thing. So what you'll do is you'll just save it. Once you press save, it'll be wherever you decided to save it. I would just say desktop. That's the easiest for me, but if you have your own process, that's fine. The exam does tell you to do this, so please just make sure you do this, or else I can't forward engineer, and then it's a real big hassle. So what I did is I created this users. And what I did also is there is, I know a couple of you guys have been asking, is there some sort of default thing to where I don't always have to say, on update now and created at now? You can do this default expression when created, where on created at, you just say now. So once it's created, it's going to run the now, unless you put something else, obviously. And then for the updated at, you can say now. So once it's created, it's going to update it. And then on update. So anytime you run that update query, it's going to then, run the now in place for this date time. So this is a default place or a default expression that you don't, that way, when you're creating something, you don't have to pass created at and updated at and say now. This will automatically do that for you. So that's what I did. I also created an ID, making sure that my primary key, it's of type int, but I've got it is my primary key. It cannot be null, so it's not null. And then this is important, making sure that it auto increments. Make sure that your int in your ID auto increments, or else you're going to have to start passing that in every time. That gets very confusing very quickly. You're going to have to start over because it can get very confusing. I've also got this first name and last name, email, and password. Now, one thing I want to point out is a lot of times what I see with students when they're trying to create a login and registration is they've got this, they've got this password and confirm password. And then what they do is in their actual ERD, they have a column called confirm password. We don't need to do that. And if you think about it, the reason is we want to make sure, and we talked about normalization of our tables, and it's a way that we don't repeat data, right? If you think about it, password and confirm password, if done correctly, are the same exact thing. So we're actually just bloating our database and saving information that is, we already have it in password. So that can confuse some students, just making sure you remember if you have a confirm password, we're still going to use it. We're going to use that with our validator, but we actually don't need that as a column. We just need this password. Cool. I went ahead and forward engineered this. So that way in my actual instance, I have got this login and reg with some tables. The only table is my users. And then it's got all my columns right here, all set up. I did also, because this is a larger day, instead of you watching me code some of the stuff you've already seen, I went ahead and built out sort of the entire, not the entire thing. We're going to talk about the functionality, but really the basic stuff I've already built out. I modularized this. So I have my server PY, right? I've got my Flask app here. That's got my config, my MySQL connection PY. Always remember, if your password is different than root, make sure you do change that here. And if your username's different, then make sure you change that there. So I have that guy right there. I've got a controller for my user. It doesn't do anything right now. Again, this is just kind of a boilerplate. It just shows an index.html. I've got a model for my user, something very basic that we have done where I just have my definite of my user. Again, I don't have that confirm password here. It's just password. That's all we're really worried about. We'll use confirm password, but this is all we're really worried about. And then I've got a template. And this template is basically just 2 forms. That way, one is login and registration. So let me go ahead. I am Python 3 server.py. Let's go ahead and get this running and see what it looks like. Something I did wrong. No module name Flask from Flask, import Flask. Oh, I literally use this.
You also ran it as Python 2, so I don't know if that messes with it.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it shouldn't. But...
Oh, yeah, I did. Thanks, Peter. There you go. Always run Python 3. Thank you. Cool. Cool. So let's look at what we've got so far. If I just come to this localhost 5000, I've just got this form. It's called register user and login user. What we're going to talk about today is something that's really important, because forms is how we get our data, right? Forms is how we get the values that our users getting. And data really is money. If you think about the largest companies in the world, it's data. It's Google, it's Apple, it's Facebook. All of those are data companies, right? And so we want to make sure that we are good when we're getting our data, but we also want to make sure that we are getting good data. A way to prevent that is right now, and what we've typically done is we've created a way for us to create a user, right? Pretty simple. What we did is we walked into this. I've got my index.html, doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and create a user, right? So on my form, I've got this form. This is my, I'll just comment this as my register form that goes to user register. We talked about this user slash. As a reminder, that is what we call RESTful routing. Anything that's associated with my user, I'm going to start the route with user. That way I can kind of keep everything together. So I don't have that built. So let's go ahead and build this so far. I've got this at app.route. That's going to be user/register. Perfect. And I'm missing one thing. It is a form. So the methods equals post. Cool, because it is a post form. Now I've got a def. I'm going to say register user. It's going to take in what's doing right now. So I've got this guy right here. And for right now, what I want to do is I just kind of want to figure out what I want to do. I want to figure out what I'm trying to accomplish. And what I'm trying to accomplish is I'm trying to get a user. Now, I know that I showed you guys the request.form, passing in the request.form. With this and with what we're trying to do with register user and validating this data, I'm going to actually explain it in the old way that we used to do, where I just have this data right here, where I've got just this dictionary of data, and it's taking in these values from request.form, from last name, request.form last name, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to show why here in just a bit, because I want to do something with this password. But for right now, you guys have seen this before, right? This is how I would create a user. And what I would say is something like user equals user.create user, right? Where I'm going to pass it in some sort of data. And then maybe I return redirect to, we'll have a success page. That way, I know that it works. And I'll have to get that in just a bit. But we've done this before, right? I can create a user. I have to go into my models. Then I don't have a class method called create user. So let's go ahead and create that. Got a class method. It's going to be def create user. Takes in CLS and it takes in data. Perfect. Now I'm going to do some stuff. Well, what we were doing at the beginning, whenever, kind of all we've done so far is we just had a query, and all that query did was basically create a user, right? I had a query that inserted a user and its values, something like this, where I insert into users. That's my table. Yeah, that's my table where the first name, last name, email, and password. Again, because I did the default now for the created at and the default now for updated at. I don't have to pass that into this query. And then the values come from my data, right? This first name, last name, email, and password comes from my data. And then what I would do is I would return, and then I would actually run this, right? My table or my database is called login reg. I'd run this query and run this data. Any questions on this so far? This was just, I went a little bit quick, but it's something we've been doing. Okay. We've been doing, yeah. Can you put a 1 in the chat if this makes sense? And then a 0 if you need me to go a little bit back. Yeah, perfect. Blake just put apostrophes. I love it. Okay, so that makes sense. But one thing to note is if I were to run this, right? If I were to actually run this form or submit this form right now, and we had a riveting conversation in the office hour about input default types. But right now, this would create a user. It'll create a row in my database with empty data. And that's something we want to prevent, right? That's something that we want to make sure doesn't happen because we want good data, whether we're going to sell it to somebody, if we're like Facebook, or let's say we just want to make sure that we can contact and have a good email or sometimes we fat finger stuff and that just happens, right? Sometimes you fat finger stuff and then you put the wrong email or wrong password. And so we can create validations to prevent data from being bad, right? That way our user has the correct email or email type, has the correct password, and make sure that, we also have good data. We have a first name, we have a last name, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where this idea of form validation comes in. So what we can do is there's a couple things we can do. Flask has something called Flash which is a built-in library that allows us to show an error, right? If there's an error or if there is some sort of message I want to convey based off of data, I can do that. The way I use it is if we're going through the platform here, I go into my models. I don't need that anymore. I go into my models, user PY, and at the top, what I actually put is from Flask, import Flash. Cool. And we're going to see what that does here in just a second. Now, before I even want to get to a point where I can run this create user, I'm going to want to have some sort of filter, some sort of filtration system that prevents, bad data from happening, right? I kind of want to clean my data. I want to inspect my data before I even go and try to create a user. And that's where our validator is going to come in. So what a validator does is it checks the data against the parameters that we set. And if anything is wrong, it lets us know, right? Hey, the name's not long enough, or this is not the correct type of password, or some sort of, integer issue, something like that. But what it does is it validates the data, checks and says, okay, no, this is good data. This is ready for the database. And so that's what we're going to create. The way we do that is we create, and if you maybe remember, we talked about static methods. A static method is something that's not necessarily associated to an instance or the class itself, but it's something that we can use. It makes sense right now for us to put it in our user model because it's associated with my user, but just know that it is a static method, not necessarily a class method or anything of that nature. So what I'll do is in my model, I'm going to create a static method, static method. And this is going to be called user validator. Now, obviously, as always, this name can be arbitrary. It doesn't necessarily matter. But user validator, in my opinion, makes sense, but it does need to have some data, right? What is the data that it is going to be checking to see if it's good? Because it's not a class method, I don't have to type in CLS, and it's not a instance method, so I don't have to type in self. I just put in data. Now, what it does is when I am sending over my data, this guy, I want to check to see if these values match some sort of parameters that I've set. Now, in the Belt exam, you will get parameters that say, first name is must be more than 3 characters. Last name must be more than 3 characters. So we give you all that information. So it's not like you're going to have to arbitrarily fix it. There is, some leniency. It does change. Maybe you've been a part where you're trying to register for something and it says, password must be 8 characters or password must be 12 characters. That, there are some standards. Password 8 characters is pretty common. But validations are just kind of more arbitrary in the sense of it does switch between, there's not necessarily like a standard, also because names are changing, right? And some people have one letter, and there's a story of somebody who's like middle name, they didn't have a middle name, but they were going to the army. So they literally assigned the middle name of A, like the letter A. So if we were to have some sort of validator that said middle name must be more than 3 characters, but their middle name is legally the letter A, that can cause some issues. But as we're setting this up, I am creating a user. And so I'm just going to kind of go off that information. I have created this static method called user validator. And what, again, this is doing is this is checking to see, is my data valid? So as you can guess, I'm going to have something that keeps track of if my data is valid, right? I need to make sure, is this data valid? If so, then I'm good to go. So I'm going to create this variable called is valid. Now this variable can, as always, be called anything. We just want to make sure that we know the name of it because we're going to use it quite a bit. And initially we want to set it to true, right? We want to think the best of our data, and only if our data shows an error, then I want to go ahead and set it to false to say, hey, there is an error. So what do I do if there is an error? Well, what I can do is I can check. And typically what you're going to check when it comes to a validation standpoint is basically the length, like how many characters there are, or if there's a number, is it above a particular thing, right? Again, those sort of parameters. So if my user is trying to register, I can say if len of, now I passed in data up there, right here. So I've got to say data here. If this were to say form data, then this would say form data, just knowing that that's what that means. But I'm saying if that of first name, this is coming from this guy, right? This right here, particularly this guy right here, my key. If at that key, this value is less than three characters, what do I want to do? Well, I want to generate an error, right? I want to say, hey, there's an error. You didn't give me good data. So what I'll do is I'll say flash. That's us using that flash, that built-in library. And I'll say first name must be at least 3 characters. Perfect. Then I also remember my validator, what's keeping track is if my data is valid, is valid true, right? This Boolean. Well, if there's an error, then I want to go ahead and set that to false. So I can say is valid equals false. One thing to note on Flash, Flash uses session, right? It keeps and it stores these strings basically in session for one cycle, if you will. And so if you are setting this up, you do need to have session whenever you get to your init py, you do need to have your app.secret key. So please just make sure that you remember that and are working through that as well. Cool. Sure, let's save. I don't know what I did. Oh yeah. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Does that make sense? Any questions on this first validation? Cool. I'm going to do the same thing with my last name. Same sort of thing. You say last name must be at least 3 characters, and my is valid is false. So even if this first one hits, it's going to check, right? And it's going to, it's still going to be false, but it's going to add this string into this Flash session memory. So that way I can show that on my front end. Now, if we're looking at the platform, what I could do is I could do something with my email, right? And say, basically, if email is less than X amount of characters. But if we look at the platform, there is something called our pattern validation. And this is something called regex, and it's a really popular thing. Regex is basically a pattern validation to make sure that it is in the correct way that you want it to be. You don't have to memorize regex by any stretch of the imagination. There's plenty of websites. You can just Google, like password with 8 characters and, 1 capital and 1 special character regex. And then there are regex expressions there. But if we're just going to kind of walk through it, this is what it's doing. This is in R. This is saying that this is a raw string in Python. So this is declaring that this is a raw string. Basically, we're not trying to do anything funny. We're not trying to do some sort of like F string kind of stuff. This is a raw string in Python. And then if you kind of look at it, you can see the bones of a email address, right? Here, I've got A through Z, lowercase, A through Z, uppercase, 0 through 9, a dot, a plus, an underscore, and a dash. I am allowing anything that is a lowercase A through Z, uppercase A through Z, 0 through 9. I'm allowing a dot, a plus sign, an underscore, and a dash. Right? So if I'm Will underscore Calhoun, that's okay, right? I'm allowing that in my regex. I'm saying this pattern's okay. Then I have this at sign. And then the second part after the at mimics close to the same thing, right? There's a couple things I don't have, like this plus sign. I can't have that, but I do still have an underscore and a dash. And then at the end, I've got this dot. And then I'm saying, okay, this must be just letters, right? Lowercase or uppercase, that's fine, but it must be letters. And then this $sign says, okay, end of this raw string here, we're good to go. Again, this is not a thing that you must memorize. Yes, like Peter put in the chat, Regex 101 is a great tool for practicing regex and making sure it works. We give it to you here, right? So I'm actually going to cop this from the platform.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Yes.
So in this where it says at, right? After at, what we can put or what can be valid. Like if you think of email, like usually after email, like at we have Gmail, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there are like, maybe I don't know, like there are things that after add also we can add numbers.
Yeah. I think if you're like, your company is like called 7 Ways with the number 7. Does that,
Okay,
think if your company has a dash between it, like my mom's company has a dash between its name. And so it's at, and then her company first part dash second part. So this is allowing all of those, you know,
Okay.
if your company is, trying to think of a company that like 3M, which is a massive like printing, they just like do a bunch of stuff. But 3M, right, is at 3m.com. Well, there's a 3 and then the lowercase m. Okay, that works out. And even if it's an uppercase, it can do that too.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. And you can modify these. If you wanted it to only be letters, then you could absolutely get rid of that stuff, right? You can just have A through Z, just like we have here. So you can, there are different types of regex. It's not, this is a pretty simple, this is a pretty simple one. And this is, you don't actually have to build it out. We supply this, and on the exam, you can do this as well. So if I'm looking at this, if I want to use regex, there's a couple things that I have to do. Regex is a module in Python, and I actually have to import it. So if I go to my code, I'm going to go to my user PY, and at the top where I have all of my stuff, I'm going to say import RE. This is importing the regex module in Python. Cool. So now I can use it. Then I'm actually just going to copy and paste this. And again, you guys are absolutely welcome to do this on the exam. Now it has it put right here, right? The platform has it up here, which is fine. You don't need to do it right there in the sense, because this is my only validator. So I could, in theory, put it like this. Either one works. I'm just going to keep it here, but either one works. One thing to note, when you see in Python everything all caps, that's usually a way that a software engineer is trying to indicate that this is a constant variable. Python doesn't have that. Now, maybe if you, I don't know if in JavaScript, if you guys talked about ES6 for const and let, you talked about the different variable types. But what it is basically a constant variable is something that is what we call immutable, meaning you can't change it. It must stay that way, right? It's immutable. And so in Python, if you see email regex, that is the developer trying to indicate, hey, this is a constant variable. Don't change this value. Don't reassign email regex to something else. Just keep it here. Again, if you wanted to do this lowercase, you absolutely could, but just wanted to say in the wild, if you see this as all caps, that's what that's trying to, that's what the developer is trying to convey. And what this is doing is this is using the module of RE and the method within that called compile to create this, pattern that we want to process. Cool. Everybody, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions on that? Cool. So what I can do is, because I have this pattern and I have an email being passed through, I can do this. I can say if not, meaning if this comes out to false, I run this email regex. This is data. Sorry. I run this email regex. I have this value right here, and I run the dot match on it. So what it's going to do is it's going to take this pattern and it's going to see if the value being passed through from my email matches the pattern of email regex, right? Does it have this at the front, this after the at, this after the dot? If it doesn't, right? That's what this if not means. Like if they don't match, then I want to get an error, flash invalid email address, and then I want to set is valid equal to false. Does anybody have any questions on this guy right here?
Hey, well, I got a question. I'm just curious why you would want to use the not logical operator, just not use anything else or set the value. I mean, I understand what the functionality is. I'm just trying to understand whoever came up with this why, and not just go directly to, set it to, whatever the conditional expression value would be. I know the initial, when you create a conditional expression, it's going to be true, right? And the else statement will probably lead to false, but why use not in this case?
To check to see if this, so like if this is not true. Like, yeah, it is like a weird Python really I don't see it in JavaScript or C# or MERN even. But it is like you're right. It is kind of doesn't roll off the tongue. You're like, if not, like this doesn't make sense. But what this is saying is if this is not true, right? If this, in the same way that I can say if, and then I just do some sort of condition, and that's saying like, if this is true, then do this, right? If valid, if is valid, if that's true, then it's going to do something. And if not, it's going to do something else. And so it is just a weird Python thing that is really a shorter way to say if this is false.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, you could say if, email regex equals false, they would do the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just a shorter way of saying if not email regex, but I totally understand what you're saying. Peter said no reason to have the email regex anywhere else outside of where it's used. They might have done it that way in the portal for readability. Yeah. So I'm not, if I was going to, maybe I had a couple validators, if I was doing this more on a global, like there was a couple places that somebody could register, there were certain methods that were going to deal, and I wanted to compare an email regex, I would put it up here, right? Because then I can just call on that globally. This email regex is a variable that is alive within this method in the scope of this method, but I can't access it anywhere else. I don't need it, right? I don't need it in any other method. So I can put it here, but Peter's exactly right. If I wanted to do email regex on something else, well, then I could put it up here, and then now it's a global variable and I can access it in any sort of method. Great job, Peter. Cool. So I validated and checked to see if my name is good. I've checked to see if my last name is good. I've checked to see if my email matches. Now there's two things that I want to check, right? Now I've got my password. So I can say if the length of my password of data is less than, let's say 8. That's usually a pretty common one. If the length of data password is less than 8, then I want to create a flash message that says password must be at least 8 characters. Perfect. Now, this is where that confirm password comes in. Like I talked about, we're not going to put that in my model. I'm not going to put that in my database. But what I can do is in my validator, utilize that information to see if they match, because sometimes, and it kind of seems like a pain in the butt, but really it's a company doing you a favor, because sometimes I know for myself, I type incorrectly like all the time, right? Like, I forgot to do is valid equals false. But what we're about to do does is it makes sure that even if you fat finger the first password, odds are you're not going to do it twice. If you do it twice, then, it's kind of on you. But even if you do, it might say, oh, they don't match. And then, you kind of go back and do it again. And you're like, oops, I must have just pressed something wrong on either one. But what I can say is something like this. I can say if data of password does not equal data of confirm password, then I can create some sort of error that says, it's my flash message that says passwords must match. I cannot type today, sorry guys. Is valid is going to equal false. Perfect. So I've gone through all my information and I've prevented any sort of bad data, right? I've prevented my name from being anything less than 3 characters. My last name can be anything, it can't be anything less than 3 characters. I've made sure that the email type is correct. We're good to go there. The length of my data, length of my password is more than 8 characters, sorry. And making sure that my confirmed password is good to go. Now, the only thing left to do is I want to return this is valid. Ahmad, do you have a question?
Very quick. I'm a little confused in the model of our database. we just have the password, not the confirm password. And now we brought the confirm password topic. Why
Yeah.
is that?
Yeah. So like I was saying, we don't want to put it in our database because it's just that they should be the same, right? And we don't really want to store two of the same pieces of information. What this does is it allows me to make sure that when these are being passed in, right? If I'm creating a password, I want to make sure that they're the same just for the reason I just talked about, right? I want to make sure that my user does put their correct password. And if they fat finger, I want to catch that before they have to go in and update it and they can't log in and it's a pain and they don't want to use my application anymore. Now it's not in my database, but it's still being passed through within my form. And so what I can do is with that, as it's being passed through right here, right? Here's my input type. I can then go and pass that in to what I will use is I will actually say something like valid equals user dot user validator, where I pass in my data, right? So I'm going to pass in my form data to my validator, and then it's going to return this is valid, which is a Boolean of either true or false, right? I'm using this confirm password here. I am getting the value from that form, but I'm just using it to make sure that they match. That's it. I'm not going to store it anywhere. It's just a quick way to make sure that my user has a better experience because they don't put a bad password. They log in, and then when they have to go redo their password, they have to go, and then they have to, like walk through how to get a new password. And it's just a pain. They don't want to use my application anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but overall, we are not capturing this in our database just to
No.
have less data, right?
Nope. We don't have any. Yeah, because if they do it correctly, which in order to register, they have to do it correctly. These are going to be the same thing, right? I don't need to store two of the same thing.
Okay, got it.
Make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Now, this is a great way that I can check and see if this is valid. But if we think about it, there's one more thing that I could do here. Can anybody tell me or guess what I could do to kind of really lay out this validator and make sure that it mimics basically a real world application, a real world thing? What is something that could be different?
It tells you if it's not.
Yeah, it tells you if it's not. Let's go do that. Yeah, exactly. Let's do that. That's not what I was getting at, but let's do that.
Okay. Tells you if you're a robot or not.
Yeah, yeah, it tells you if you're a robot. Checks to see. Actually, before we do that, I want to talk about one other thing is, let's say that I signed up for something and I'm using a password or I'm using my email address. Well, if I go and try to re-register, will it let me do that? What happens? What happens if it, what does it do? If I try to re-register with that same email?
Account has existed.
Yeah, we typically say like, hey, this account already exists. So let's actually set that up so we can have a good working validator to make sure that we also don't repeat information, right? I don't want my user to be able to have 4 accounts with the same email, because then all of a sudden I'm again bloating up my database and I have too much data that just kind of matches. So this is a little bit more, and we'll go slow here, but let's say I want to check to see if email is already in database. Let's do that.
Is this black belt? I'm just curious.
Nope, not necessarily. So if we're doing this, I know that I'm going to have some sort of check, right? I need to go into my database and check to see, well, is this already existed, right? So what I'm going to do is within my validator, I'm actually going to do something like this. I'm just going to say connection, and that's going to say connect to MySQL. And it's just kind of my connection to my database. Login reg is what I called it. Then I'm going to write a query. And my query is going to say select all from users where, and then here is where I want that email where email equals. And then as a reminder, we want to make sure we protect against SQL injection for any sort of thing. And so then I say email, because that's what is being passed through here. So this query is going to go into my database, right? It's going to check my users table, and it's going to get me a list of the users. And remember, it always comes back as a list because it's going to give me, whenever I'm doing a select, a list of the users whose email matches. So what I can do is I can say something like this: results equals connection. Now, again, I could have just done it like this actually, and that's what I've been doing. So I'm just going to do it this way. Dot query DB, where I'm going to pass it in my query and my data, right? Because I want to be able to have access to this email right here. So this results is going to be a list of all the emails that match. So a list, there are some built-in methods, right? Functions I can do on a list. One of them is a length, right? I can see how many things are in there. So I can say if len of results does not equal 0, meaning there is something in there, right? That means that there is an email that came back on that query that matched that exact email. If it doesn't equal 0, then I'm going to say flash email already exists. Please try logging in. And then I will say is valid equals false. Does that make sense? I want to check. I run the query. Basically, I'm just getting a list of users that emails match. I run that actual query right there. I put it in this variable called results. Results is just a list of whatever came back. Then I'm checking that list and saying, hey, if it's greater than 0, meaning there's anything inside of there, well, then there's anything inside of there, that means it already exists, right? So I'm going to create a message that says email already exists. Please try logging in. And then I set this to false. Any questions on this? Does that make sense?
Okay, well, I take it the order of operation matters here. So the query and the results, both variables have to be after the input, after we check or validate for the email address.
Not necessarily. No, because all it's going to do is it's going to sequentially check either way. So if it doesn't match, then if it doesn't match, right, if it's not a good email, then it shouldn't be in our database anyway. So it's going to check it, and then there's not going to be anything in there. So in theory, they could be in any order. Somebody else had a question?
I had a question. Talking of real world validation for this registration, right? Because I can see we have not focused more on the password validation side. We have just one criteria, add characters, that's it. But we know, I mean, someone can put, even at the password, they can put their email. Again, that's a add character, and there you go. But we also have validation for password validation. Okay.
So there is an entire regex. If you wanted to dive in, there's an entire regex that you do that same thing with password, right? Where you can say that it's of a certain length. It must contain a lowercase, a capital, special characters, something, whatever. So you can do a regex for password as well.
Again, repeating, copying, and then putting some criterias, right?
Yeah. So you would have some sort of like password regex equals RE, right? And then here you would just say, if not match, right? There's some built-in stuff with the password. And if it doesn't match, then you say, hey, password must, you would have a flash message that says password must contain X amount of characters, a special character, a lowercase and uppercase, XYZ, whatever conditions you set. But yeah, you can just, I mean, even if you like just did, there's all kinds of different, here's a minimum of 8 characters, minimum of 1 special character, a minimum of 1 uppercase and lowercase required. So this is a regex for password. I'll put this in the chat for you guys. If you did want to play with it, you could say, hey, does it match, right? Does this information match that? But yeah, you can Stack Overflow and stuff has all the regex right here. Here's a great thread. I'll put this in the chat too, if you wanted to mess around with that. But yeah, in theory, in a real use case, you would use something like that too.
Awesome. One side question, just if you want to answer after the class, that's fine. Like in some websites, like big companies, like in the password I have used add, they have accepted, and some of them they have not used in the password add. Like they have their own, they are playing with characters. Like it's a headache, right? A little when you're creating passwords, some of them they're accepting, some of them not. Is there a kind of a general rule for all big companies that they should have to follow? This is the best practice we should follow.
We're going to get to that in just a second. So yes and no. From a security standpoint, the longer your password, the better off you are. So that's why typically it's a minimum of 8. And so I think that if you're doing anything less than 8, that's likely not a great secure area, just being transparent with you. So I would check that. A really common one is what we just saw, where you have minimum of 8 characters, at least 1 letter, 1 number, and 1 special character, or even, which would be a little bit better, is the uppercase, lowercase, a number slash, like this guy right here. Minimum of 8, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 number, 1 special character. In my opinion, is like pretty encompassing. It's pretty hard to crack. We're going to use something called bcrypt here in just a second, where we can actually hash our password, and we're going to see what that looks like here in a bit. And then that way we can save it from a secure standpoint. But in my opinion, anything less than 8 is not a great, it's not very secure. I'd be very cautious of what I put there. Because again, the more characters you actually have, the harder it is to crack something.
And thinking of 2 factors, 3 factors authenticator, right? What do you think of that? Like I was thinking, like nowadays we have 2-factor, 3-factor authenticator, but how about like big companies, or when we are creating our website in the registration, why we should not have that option while registering, and to have an option, okay, at the same time, introduce us your second authenticator, your another email or your phone number, all these stuff. So to solve it at one spot, not playing around.
It's because what if somebody gets your number?
Oh,
right?
the data.
Yeah. So that's a big deal right now, is there's a ton of things that go out there, and I could talk about this for a while. So I'm going to give it 1-2 minutes, maybe. Right now, if you get an email and somebody's asking for your number, never give it, because it is a 2-factor authentication. That is how scammers are doing it. What is happening is they're getting maybe they have a password from a data leak and they want to get your phone number. They get your phone number. They go to this company and says, hey, I want to redo my password. Here's my phone number. Like, so they can hack in, get that phone number, get that, and redirect it to another phone. So that way they can basically get that new code. So that 6-digit code that Google or whoever's sending you, do that. And then they can hack into your information, whether it's a bank, something like that. So you should never do that. And the other thing that I see happen all the time, and you should never do, is on Facebook, when somebody says, let's see how much pride you have. What was your middle school's mascot? Right? And then people are like, woo, Cougar Pride right here. That is a security question that people ask, right? So it's a way that they fish and get your security questions, like, oh, I still remember my best friend from the 3rd grade. His name is so-and-so. Drop your best friend's name on Facebook. That is a very popular way that they steal data from people, especially that are a little bit older. But it's a very popular way that they steal data, is by doing something like that. So authentication is something that's interesting. You're starting to see more of, like, if I am going to go to something like, let's say, HackerRank, authentication can make or break a company. And so what ends up happening, oh, dang it, if I log out, okay, here we go. I can sign up in code, and you can see here that now they have or connect with. The reason people are doing this is because Facebook, right, is massive. They care about security. Google, massive, cares about security. LinkedIn and GitHub are both Microsoft. So these are your 3 big ones, right? And then there's Apple, but Apple's not there. By doing connecting with this, their companies are pushing authentication onto the larger companies who can invest in people who can write the biggest and most powerful architecture that is really, really hard to crack. And so you are seeing that versus, that's why I always, if Google goes down, everybody goes down, if we're just being honest, right? So I typically just connect with Google because it's like, I trust Google, and they are security, right? So if Gmail got hacked and everybody's information got done, think of how detrimental that will be. So they're willing to pay the big bucks to get the best in the world for cyber security, cyber architecture. And so that's what you're seeing from a real world perspective of signing up. That's why they wouldn't have that information there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. So we've done quite a bit of stuff. Now let's go ahead and check to see what's happening. So I've got this user validator. I've got all this information. We're querying. We are good to go. Cool. So here I'm calling this validator. I'm not going to do anything. And I'm actually just going to return to my index. I don't really want to go to success yet. I don't have that built, and I don't know that I will now. Direct. Cool. So what I want to check is I want to print out, and let's see if it works. Before you even do anything, let's go ahead and see if this valid works. Now, this is a great thing before you start trying to populate and create your database, especially in your belt exam. Make sure you're checking to make sure your validator works, because you don't want to put bad data within your database, and you want to make sure that everything is good to go. So let's go ahead and see if this works. What's going to happen is once I submit my form, it's going to either print if it's valid or if it's false, right? Because that's what my validator, it returns this is valid. So it returns either true or false. I'm just going to print that and we'll do some stuff there. So this is going, let's see if this is running. That's still running. So if I refresh my page and I create a user, I didn't put anything in there. Okay, let's check. It came back as false. Perfect, right? Even though it ran a query where from users where email equaled just an empty string, right? So it's not going to break that. But let's say that I say something like this, will Cal c@c.com. I would encourage you guys on your belt exam, you're going to be so stressed. Just put your password as password. It's 8 characters. Like put it for everybody, because then you're going to go try to do something different. Just put it as password. But if I create user, all of my conditions should be true. If I check, okay, true. So my validator's working, right? I'm able to validate my code. I didn't do anything. It did false. I put in everything that should match and everything said true. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and do something, because I've checked to see if my validator is true, right? It is. I'm good to go there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say something like this. If valid. Sorry, Dennis, it's the same sort of thing though. Saying if this is true, if valid comes back as true, well, what do I want to do, right? I want to say user equals user dot create user. I'm going to pass it my data. Right now, only if my data is good and it's true and it's been through my validator, well, then I want to go ahead and pass it in, right? And then we'll just do this for right now. Maybe let's return redirect, or maybe we'll do this. We'll just print. Sorry. Way to go. User created. Perfect. And then I will return redirect. I know it's going to go to the same route, but you typically won't do that. So I'm just going to do it for right now. Cool. So right now I'm going to be able to put in some data. If that data is true, I want to create a user. I want to print way to go, user created, and then I want to redirect back just to the same page. So if I refresh this, perfect. I'm going to say check cal c. I create user. Cool. I'm here. I look, running query, debugger's active, didn't print. Let's go into my actual tables. Did it work? Did I do something incorrect? Huh. Well, looks like I did something incorrect. Let's go check and see what I did. So I didn't get into this guy right here. I have my user creator, create user, insert. That should be good to go. Login reg. Let's go ahead and try one more time. Maybe there's just I'll stop my server and then try running it again. I'm going to say check cal c@c.com. I create my user. Oh, there we go. I don't know what I did. Looks like I had an error. But it says, way to go, user created. Running query, values, something went wrong. You have an error in your SQL syntax. Oh, I forgot to put the apostrophe. Okay. Either way, I've got my user created. So if I come here and I were to run this, I don't see a user.
Just let's make sure we have connected or linked to the database while pip env install flask by MySQL.
I do have that, know that, but if I do a pip list,
Yeah, let's check it here.
I
Yeah,
got my
I,
MySQL, I got Flask. I even have.
I think,
Yeah. Good.
I think it's whining about your closed parenthesis in your SQL query is what it was saying there.
Let's
I
look.
caught it right.
Which query?
Values. Yeah, no parenthesis at the end there.
Híjole.
Always,
Okay,
always.
I
There's
always
like-
do that, guys. This is the third time I've done this. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Everyone in class does it too. That's the funny thing.
I should just default. It's probably because I'm teaching you guys. I'm sorry that I failed you. All right, let's go try it again. Good news. It did print out because it went through the validator. The data was valid. I just wasn't able to throw it in totally, but it did do it, right? It did ran it and then it ran this because it was valid. This ended up not working, but it still printed this. So I know my validator is working. So here we go. My server's down because I took it down. LOL, what a time to be alive. Okay. So if I say Chuck Cal c@c.com. Perfect. Create my user. Now let's see if it worked. Way to go, user created. So if I come here and I refresh, now I see Chuck Cal c@c and password. So I know that it works. Now, if I did have an error, I do want to be able to show that, right? I do want, like, I want to not just have it to where it doesn't work. So what I want to do is if there is an error and it's preventing that from happening, what you can do is you can actually just copy paste this guy and put it up here. Now, what this is doing is this is going to iterate through this messages idea. So right above this, let's just say right here. Ew, gross. Let me just format this real quick for you guys. So what this is doing is this is saying with messages, get flashed messages. Now, when we say that flash, what it's doing is it's a flash messages. It's a built-in thing with flash. And so I'm saying if there are messages, meaning if there is something in flash, and again, the way something would be created is if this is true, right? This is creating something within my flash. So we're saying if that is true, then I want to iterate through those messages and I want to show them. So let's go back. Let's refresh. Now you might say, oops, what the heck? Doesn't make sense. Remember I said that Flash uses session. And so it is only alive for the first, for one iteration, but it does keep track of the Flash messages. So all you have to do is just refresh. The first time you do connect this, it's going to have a list of all your messages. If you're testing the validator a couple times, it's going to have a whole big list. You might think you break it. You didn't. You just come here, refresh, and then now you're good to go. But now if I click create user, oh, it doesn't work. First name must be at least 3 characters. Last name must be at least 3 characters. But more importantly, I do not get the way to go user created, right? I do not get that because it wasn't valid data. Therefore, it didn't create it and I was protected there. That is validations. Are there any questions on this? Any questions at all? Does this make sense? Is it kind of cool to like start seeing validations and be like, oh, this is a real world thing. I see this all the time. And now I know how to build this in.
So are you saying that list of errors is just going to keep getting longer, or is that going to refresh
Nope.
or clear?
So yeah, so it only is alive for like this one instance. So even if I were to try to create another user, like let's say this condition will be met because it's 3. If I do this, it just gets rid of them for that. It is only alive for like 1 iteration. So it won't keep growing or anything like that.
If you kept making errors, would it keep growing? But I guess that wouldn't matter. I guess what you're saying is once you've successfully registered, then that goes away.
Yeah. And I would actually probably put
Okay.
this. That would make more sense if I came up and did something like that. That would make more sense. Yeah. Cool. So that's validations. Now, one thing that is wildly important is to note that here in my database, you can see ID, first name, last name, email, and you see password. And this is a big no-no, is you actually see the password that I put. The string of password is in my database. Now, just so you know, databases get breached all the time. All the time they get your information. That's why there's a great website called Have I Been Pwned is what I think it's called. And it is like a nonprofit, like it's legit. But basically you can put your email and you can check to see if your email has been leaked in a data, like from a hacker, right? And so we want to make sure that we prevent any sort of password from being put in just a plain text sort of way. This is the worst sort of security because if a database gets breached, now they have your password. And if we're all being honest, we all have maybe a couple passwords that we use every time. We don't have a new password for everything. So this could be a really big deal, right? If all of a sudden this, like, for instance, MyFitnessPal is an application that I've used to like track food, right? It has my email and it has a password. MyFitnessPal, which was owned by Under Armour, got breached. And my email and my password got sent out to the ether. If somebody were to grab that and maybe find out what bank I go to, and if I'm like most humans, I do have a different financial password, but if I'm like most humans, a lot of people just have one email and one password, right? So if they go and they take that email and password just like this, they would see this entire, it would look just like this, right? The data that they get. Let's say they went to Wells Fargo and typed in c@c.com. They typed in password. Now they have my account information. Now they can transfer money to some sort of account. They can do anything they want with my financial stuff. So we want to make sure that even if our database does get breached, it does get hacked, there's something else we can do. And that's where something called bcrypt comes in. Now, before we can even really understand bcrypt, there is a great, and I would really encourage you guys, there's a great video right here that talks really in depth about hashing passwords. But basically it's a way that we can take a password and we can hash it and scramble it in some sort of way to prevent somebody from really seeing, something like just password. Here in this video, you see that if if this is somebody's password, let's say it's Morty, if you hash it, this is what the hash comes out to. This string right here represents the word Morty. And that's okay, right? That's great because now in my password, in my database, I'm not seeing Morty, I'm seeing a hash. But one thing to know is not all hashes are made equally. There are 2, MD5 and SHA-1, that are trash. They've been around for a long time. They're very common. And on the dark web, you can actually buy a table of MD5 passwords. So it will look something like this, where you've got a name or you've got a word and you've got the hash. And so it is a very real thing to where you can sell data. You can sell some sort of, let's say I hacked in and they use an MD5, right? If I have and I buy some sort of like table that has that information, I just put in a hash, and it's so populous now, it's so big because MD5 has been around for a long time, that it can very quickly figure out what the actual password is. And so SHA-1's the same sort of way. And when it comes to hashing, one thing we do want to do, because this is what it will look like after we hash the password, right? Instead of it just saying password, it'll have a hash. We want to make sure that we can encrypt our data, right? That's what we are trying to do. Make sure that it is not a way that we can reverse it to where it says like back to Morty, right? We want to make sure that, okay, this has changed, and there are different algorithms we can use to do that. Like I said, MD5 is something that's not, it's very, very common. It's been hacked. That information is out there. So we are obviously not going to do that one. There is a really fascinating podcast from I'll send it to you. It's called the Darknet Diaries, and it's about VTech. And it really is I'll send it to you guys this week. It's one about how a guy hacked into a company using SQL injection, which is what we talked about 2 weeks ago. And they had an MD5 hash, and he was able to get all the information because you can brute force and get a computer to basically crack the code. So what they added to is like, okay, a hash isn't good enough, so we're going to add some salt. And salt is basically just random letters to add in addition to the actual word. And so let's say back coming up here, you have this string is Homer. Well, if you add salt, maybe you're going to add more characters, and it's going to be much harder to crack, right? Because you can have different aspects of salt, different characters, different, length of the string. So it makes it much harder to crack. And just knowing that when it comes from a security standpoint, and if we're being transparent from a full stack perspective, you're probably not going to do a lot of security, especially now with the way the world is. Everybody's got sort of their cybersecurity people. But what we can do is we want an algorithm that is slow, that from a computer standpoint, it is very hard and will take a very long time for them to crack. Now, it sounds stupid, but a very long time is like 0.2 seconds. Because if there are, if you've got a password, I think it is, I can't remember if you've got a password that is like 70 characters, which is outrageous, wouldn't have, but it takes like over 1 million years to break that password, right? Because there's so many different combinations of letters and what they could be. And so by doing and using something like a bcrypt, we were able to use this algorithm that is very slow. And again, very slow is like 0.2 seconds, but we're able to use that to know that it's actually not really worth a cybersecurity, like a hacker's, there needs to be so much computational power to what they call, it's called brute forcing, to where you're basically just trying every single combination out there. It's called brute forcing. And so it would take so much computational power that it's not worth it, right? It would take 80 years or something of that nature to like hack one password. By that time, right, whatever, computers will be in our brains. So we use bcrypt, and bcrypt is a thing that we can use to make sure we hash our password. The algorithm that it uses is very, very slow. It adds salt, and it is secure. It's the best we have. Is this a full-fledged, this will always work? No, right? Because it's cybersecurity. At the end of the day, something might happen. But right now and where we're at in technology, this is the best we have. And so we're actually going to bring that in. The way we do that is we have to install this package. So you're going to go to pip env install, and you're going to say flask bcrypt. Sorry, I always get confused with flash and flask. I've already done that. So it's already there. If we can look here, it says flask bcrypt, but all you do is within your actual shell, you just want to make sure that you pip env install flask bcrypt, and then now we're good to go. So in my model file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this information right here. So if I go to my model right here, I'm going to go to the top, and I'm going to say Flask bcrypt, import bcrypt. That way I can use that to actually hash my password. And then I need to create a bcrypt instance for my app. What is wrong? Does that satisfy it? Yeah, okay. I guess in theory I could have just done this. So do the same thing? Yeah, okay. Cool. So I bring in my app. That way I can do this in my bcrypt. But now let's see what it does, right? It talks about to generate a hash, provide the password to be hashed as an argument, right? So I'm going to pass it through this bcrypt.generate password. And then if I want to compare the passwords, we'll see what happens. So let's go ahead and look at what happens and what we can do. So within my, oh, that's in my controllers. So let's go ahead, do that in my controller as well. Sorry. It's kind of confusing. Okay. So in my controller, I am bringing in my app. I've got that. I'm bringing in Flask bcrypt. Now it doesn't show that I've got that, but I know that it's alive in my, I know that it's alive in my shell. And let's pull this up side by side. Cool. So if I'm looking at this code, here's what it says that we're going to do. So upon register, instead of, so here I've got my data, my password, confirm password, all that good stuff. What I can do is I can say something like this. I'm going to call this hashed password. That's what I just like to call it. And I'm going to say bcrypt dot generate password hash. Right, so I'm generating this hash and I'm passing it request dot form of password. So I'm passing it the password that my user is giving me and it's hashing this. So let's just actually print this. I'm going to print request dot form of password, and then I'm going to print the hash password so we can see the difference. Hash password, and then I'm going to not create a user so we can just see the difference here. Cool. So if I come, well, this was a mistake. Oh no, I can come here. If I refresh this, server's still running, we're good to go. Let's say Marley Cal MSC.com. If I create my user, cool, all good to go. And I come and check here. Here is that password string, right? When I hash it, this is what it becomes. So within my database, this is what's going to be saved. This is what it was. This is what's going to be saved. So you can tell like that's pretty sweet, right? I can now safely save something within my database. So I'm going to say something like this. I'm going to say data of hashed password equals hashed password. And as a reminder, because data, what it does is it goes into data. If this key doesn't exist, it creates it, right? And sets its value to whatever that hash password is. And then as I pass in data, what I'm going to want to do is I still want to check. It's okay to still use my validator to check that password and password. But when I come here and I am creating my user, now instead of password, I want hashed password. So I'm no longer saving just that password string. I am saving the hashed password there. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Cool. So let's go back to my code. Let's say, okay, you're now allowed to create a user again. And then let's go check out my user. So if I come back here, I'll say Marley, let me refresh. I create my user. Perfect. No error messages, so we're good to go. And then if I were to come here and I were to select, now you can see Chuck's password was password, but with my bcrypt, I've got this massive thing right here. So this is what is stored in my database. So even if they did get my password, this is the hash that they see, and it's very, very long. I believe it's 60 characters is what I think it ends up being. And that's because I use bcrypt, the generate password right here. Any questions on bcrypt?
So this hash password, right now we have applied in the creating the account. Definitely we will apply on the login as well, right? And it makes sense.
Yeah, so so we'll get to that part, but what we'll do is whenever we log in, what we can do is we can actually say check password hash. And so whenever we go and we get our user, which we're going to do in just a second when we get to login, because we're finished officially with registration, we're going to pass in, or we're going to get that hash password. We're going to get this password string, which we're passing in. What it does is this check password hash gets this value. It knows it reads its hash. However, bcrypt does that, applies that same hash to this password, and then checks to see if they're the same.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Peter, great point. So because bcrypt does do it as 60, make sure that whenever you are creating your password, you do at least a varchar of 60. Don't do 45. Great point. Cool. Any questions on this?
For the password, you just pointed out Peter's comment, 80, right? To put varchar 80 or
60.
yeah.
You
How
can do
about
80. It can be up to 60.
yeah? How about if you are putting 255? It means we are taking more space. We shouldn't do that.
Char is more space. Varchar, you're fine. So char is going to take up 255, no matter if it's lower or shorter. Varchar just limits and maxes you that, but it takes up the space needed. More dynamic.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So we're pretty done. We're done with our registration. Now let's just do this login piece. Okay. So one thing to note is when I am registering, my last little piece is I will want to likely do something like this, where I want to say, after my user is created, I want to say something like session of user ID equals user.id. The reason I want to do something like this is I want to keep track of who is logged in. And you might think, well, why do I care? Right? Like, that doesn't seem like a big deal. But if you're here on this recipes piece, this assignment, right? There is, if I were to, this is closer. You can see that there is a portion of it that says view instructions, edit, delete, and only the user who created this recipe can edit and delete it. Well, a way that I can check to say, well, is the user who created this the same user who's currently looking at this, is by checking the ID in session. And so by putting that user in session immediately, what that allows me to do is then if I'm doing something like, is the user who's currently looking at this the same user who created this, I can just check, the recipe.user ID, if that equals session user ID. And if so, well, then it's the same person. And if not, show something differently. So that's why we will always put, like with my code, we'll put, our user ID in session. And then on other routes, I can say if, session user ID or not in session, user ID, meaning that there is nobody there, this isn't a thing, then I want to make sure that they can't go to any part of my website. They have to register. Cool. Okay. So now for the last piece, yeah, I think it's Peter asked, what do they use for wireframes? There's one called Balsamic, and then Figma, I think, are the other two that they use, I believe. Those are some popular ones. But okay, let's jump in because we're going a little bit long. I want to make sure that we are good to go. So I've got this form called login, right? That goes to user/login. I don't have that, so let's go ahead and create that. That is going to go to user/login. It is a methods of post. Perfect. And then I'm going to have some sort of function, right? So I'm going to say def login or method, sorry, user. Not going to take in anything. And now we're good to go. Now, for login, you don't need any sort of validator, right? We don't need to revalidate the information. What do I really need to do? If I'm breaking it down, what I need to do is I need to check and go retrieve, kind of like we did whenever we check to make sure our email was unique, right? I need to go in and I need to get a user and say, well, does this user exist? Does this email exist? And if so, well, is the password the same? And so the same sort of thing is going to happen with my login. That's not what I need. What I'm going to do is, first off, before I do any sort of anything else, is I need to go in and I need to get my user, right? I need to get an email. I need to make sure that I can get my user by my email. So let's go do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have in my controller this method, this class method. And this class method is just going to be called, I'm just going to call it get by email. That's fine. Takes in CLS and it takes in some data, right? I need to pass in the email that I want to make sure that it happens. And I'm going to have a query. It's going to look very similar to the one that we had in our validator where it says select all from users where email equals. And again, I want to make sure I do not get SQL injection. So I'm going to pass it in this way where it says email, right? Pretty simple. Awesome. Then I'm going to say results equals. I'm going to say connect to MySQL. I want to connect to my database, which is login reg. I want to run the query DB. I need to pass it in my query that I just wrote. And I need to pass it in some sort of data, right? I need to pass it in that email so it can actually refer to that. Now, just remembering that this results, this query gives me back a list, right? Just like it does here. So it's going to look very similar. I can say something like this. If len of results is less than 1, we shouldn't ever have more because we've set up our validator to where there is no way that they can have more than 1, right? But if it's less than 1, meaning that there is not an email in there, then what I want to say is return false. Right? I just want to see, is that email in there? If not, I just want to return false. Then if it is in there, it'll get to this line 67 and I'm going to return a CLS of results. This is, again, when I run this CLS, what it does is it runs this init on my results of the first one in my list, right? Remember, this is a list. So I'm just saying I'm going to grab the first one. There should never be more than one. We have that set up to where that email cannot already exist. So if it is in there, I just want to go ahead, create a class instance of that on that first one results. And I want to return that. So I want to return that user. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
Very quick in the registration for the email, we have said, okay, if length is not equal to 0, right? Yes, and in here at the bottom, we are saying less than 1 in row 65. I'm a little confused why we are not saying, okay, not equal to.
So this is if we're checking to see if the email already exists. So my user can't, right? So if it's not equal to 0, that means there is something in there. I mean, in theory, you could say if length of results does not equal 0, they're doing the same thing, right? They would do the same thing to where, okay, that must mean that there is something in there. So in theory, you could do the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, this one's just, we want to make sure that if it's anything other than 0, it's fine. This one is, they would do the same thing. Great catch though. Yeah, there's
Yep.
no real reason to do one over the other in theory.
Real quick, a couple of people in chat mentioned on line 64 it should be login reg instead of red.
Thank you.
Yeah, and curious off of what Ahmed was saying, could you technically use this function and just say like, if this function, basically? So rather than typing out the query, if you just said like in the validator, like if this function, so either it would like, or I don't know if you'd say if or if not, but basically just try to retrieve that email. If you get something back, it would yell.
Yeah, in theory, but the issue would be you would say if this function, but what we're
Yeah.
we're doing the same thing, but what we're trying to do, if it is wrong, we create this flash and we set this as valid.
Mhm.
And what we're doing here is if it is, if there isn't anything, then I'm returning false, which I guess
Yeah.
in theory is the same.
You
So
could say-
they're just the outcome. This part, sure, right? Like this query, you could probably set that because you're using that. Let's say you're going to use that a third time. You could probably create a class variable of that query and just
Yeah.
call that. And then, even set this, right? Results equals, whatever.
Mhm.
You could probably set that as a class because you're doing the same thing here. And then you're saying if length of results blank. So yeah, in theory, you could do that. But because we're trying to accomplish something based off of those results that are different, I would do that. But yeah, if you were to do it more, like maybe one more time, I would absolutely do that.
Sure.
Any other questions on this right here? So I'm just getting a user by its email and checking to see, is that in there? Cool. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say something like this. User, this is on my login, right? Equals user dot get by email. Now I need to pass in some sort of information, but the only information I have is my form, or from my form is my email, my password, right? So I can just say quest.form. Form. Perfect. So it's going to pass in that information. It's going to check the email. And then whatever it gets back, it's either going to be false, right? Or it's going to be the actual user instance. Then what I'm going to say is this. Again, sorry, Dennis, if not user means if that is false, right? If that returns, or, you could say something like this. If user, they do the same thing, just like what Ahmad was saying, right? If not user, then what I want to do is I want to create a flash message that says, something like invalid, valid email or password. Now it's something that's kind of old school, and I do need to bring in flash up here. The way I did it right up here. Something that's kind of old school is we don't want, if my user, I think I can say flash, right? If my user has maybe the right email, but not the right password, I don't want to let them know, right? If they're trying to hack, I don't want to let them know, hey, you got a great email, but not the right password, or vice versa. Hey, you got the right password, but not the right email. I don't want to do that. So typically with a login, you will always, regardless of the error, you'll just say invalid email or password. And that's the reason why they do that, is because we want to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? We want to make sure that that is protected and you don't really give any hackers a chance. And then what I'm just going to do is I'm going to redirect back to that base route so that way they can see that flash message show up. Then if that is not the case, I need to return, not just redirect. If that's not the case, right? If it's not false, we do have a user, right? I want to make sure that, okay, I've got the email. Now let's check to see if those passwords actually match. So I'm going to say, if not, this is where I'm going to use that bcrypt check password. It's check _ password hash. So I'm checking the hash to where, and the reason I passed in that user instance is because now I can use that, right? I set it here where I can say user of user.password, sorry. So the password of that versus, so the password that came, the hash password that came from the database versus our request.form password. Again, it's this check password is going to generate or grab this password. It's going to identify the hash, apply that same hash to this, and then check to see if that is true. So if it's not true, that's that if not. So if this does not come out true, the passwords are not the same. Well, then I want to create a flash message that says something. I'm actually just gonna copy paste that. Right. And then I'm going to, I could have copy and paste both. Return redirect to show them, hey, invalid email or password. Now, if we get to this point, that means I've got an email and the passwords match. Cool. So my user is good. So what I can say is I want to say session of user ID equals user.id. Again, this user right here comes from this guy. If I were to call this unicorn, it'd be unicorn.id and unicorn.password right there. And if not unicorn. So just really kind of throwing that out there. And then maybe I want to return redirect back to, I'm just going to go back here, but I will say print successful login. So just kind of walking through this again. For my login, I'm just going to create this variable called user. I'm going to run this get by email. So I'm going to pass in the value from the form. If the email, and if it doesn't generate anything, right? If there is no email that matches, I'm going to say, hey, flash invalid email or password, and I'm going to redirect. I don't want to check both and then have two of them. I just don't want to give any hacker any sort of, leverage. Then if that does pass, okay, we do have an email, good to go. We don't read line 35 is not true. So then I go down to line 38. Then it's going to check the email. It's going to get the user from my database because that was true, right? It's going to get that password. It's going to take in the password that was given in my form. It's going to compare the two, applying the same hash that this password has. If those are not the same, again, I generate a message called invalid email or password. I return redirect. If I get to this line, because on both of my conditions that it was bad, I did a return. That means that these did not pan out right because I didn't return. So everything could be good. You could think about it. I could also say like an else, but I don't need to do that. Here I have session user ID. I'm putting that in session just in case I want to use that information later. Like we talked about with recipes, I want to see if the user who's logged in is the same user as, is the same user as whoever created it. And then here, I'm just going to print a successful login. Cool. So let's go to my form. We're good to go. My site's down. We're running it. We're chilling. If I refresh, I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to say password, create my user. There's an error. Int object has no attribute ID. Oh, because I think that's what it returns is the ID. So actually don't. Where is this? Controllers, users, PY. So let's go into my controllers. Users, PY. I think by creation, by default, yes, by creation, if you remember in my config, when I create something, it gives me the ID number. So I don't have to say user.id, I just say user. Because what is being given back to me is actually the ID of that user, not the instance in itself. Sorry about that. So just say user. Let's go back. See if my server's running. It is. I create the user. Cool. Oh, email already exists. Oh, after I did in session. So that means email already exists. It's already in my database. So let's try that. m@b.com and password. If we did it correctly, we should get something that says, hey, all good to go. Successfully logged in. Successful login. Perfect. Now, as always, if I needed to want to show my, I wanted to show these guys right here. I would do this. Save that, refresh. If I try to do something like that, I get an invalid email or password. Cool. Last couple things I want to really just show out and just make sure that you guys we're all on the same page here. If I want to check, because this will be on the exam. So if you guys stayed, then well done. If I want to check to see if, in my controller, before even a route happens. So let's say I did have a success page. That is said something like this, user/success. And let's say that that's where I would redirect. So user/success. Let's say that's at a dev success. And all it did was send you return render template to success. HTML, ML. If I wanted to make sure that my user or any user could not get to user/success unless they were logged in, then what I can do is something like this. Because I called this user ID, before I even render my template, I could say something like if user ID, because that's my key name, not in session. So if that is not a key and the only way it's in session is if they register or log in, well, then I want to return redirect to here, right? They can't get there. Otherwise, I just want to show the HTML. So this is something that might be on the black belt or the red belt, but making sure that the user does have to be logged in. And again, that's why we do this guy. We want to make sure that upon login or registration, you create this session ID. They are the same ID, so don't have like a login ID and a register ID. They're the same thing. And then you just check and take that key and say, okay, if that's the case, great. Last thing is, let's say I'm done and I want to log out. And I have like a def log out. All I do for a logout is the way that I know that I'm logged in is I'm in session, right? So I can just say session.clear. Session.clear will clear out anything in there. So you should be good to go. I'm not pulling in. Oh, I am pulling in session up there. And then I'm going to return redirect to back. If I wanted to log out, all you do, so maybe I have a button on my HTML at some point that says, it's an A tag that says /logout. Then if I wanted to do that on my success page, let's just go ahead and do that real quick. Just to show that it works. And then my users PY. That's good. I'm gonna do this on if they're logged in or if they are registered. So if I come and I refresh, check this, and then I'm done. Sorry, guys. I know this was a long one, but I want to make sure you have all the information before the exam. So if I say I'm at b.com, I say password, I can log in. I have you did it. Way to go. Right? I can say log out. And now it takes me back here. There's nothing in session. You can log out there, but it doesn't do anything. Any questions on that? Oh, there's a lot of questions in chat. So Peter asked, would you clear the session user ID on logout by using pop? No, I would just do it as this clear, or you can use flush either way. I think clear is more, I think clear uses flush as well, but flush doesn't use clear. Clear is a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Intensive. So make sure everything's cleared out. Any questions on this stuff? How are we feeling on this? You should have everything you need for the exam now. Black belt, baby. Cool. Well, that's all I have for you today, my friends.